Okay, Assalamualaikum. Good evening, selamat petang. So welcome to the course SII 1002 slash SIG 1002, which is Earth Surface Processes. I'll be taking the second part of the course, right? Dr. Arindam took the first part. My part will mostly be focusing on sediments and sedimentary rocks, okay? So, let's have a look at the syllabus first. Dr. Arindam would have shown you this already. I'll just to have a good just to remind you of the learning outcomes here, right? So at the end of the course, you should be able to describe the natural processes that modify the Earth's surface, deduce the agents that are responsible for processes of erosion and deposition, and also evaluate the sedimentological processes and principles of stratigraphy. Okay. So in terms of assessment, continuous assessment, which is in the form of tests, is 40% of the course, and then you have 60% from final exam, right? So I'll be taking half of the marks, right? So for the test, I'll be making a test later on, it'll be 20%, and then also have for the final exam, my part will be 30%. So this is the schedule for my part of the course for the next 7 weeks, right? So I will try to honor these dates here. But just remember, we're going to have during the fourth week, the class will be very near to. We're going to be sorry. During the third week, the class will be very near to Christmas, right? So most likely we're going to do the class online. But I'll inform you later. I'll update you later whether or not we can do that, depending on how many people will be traveling. There's also for the next week. It's also going to be very near to New Year, right? So we'll make the decision later on whether it's going to be online or some kind of alternative kind of way to do to the class. All right. Another important date is the 21st of January. That's the date of your test. So please block your calendar for the 21st of January. That's going to be 20 marks. So here's a list of references that would be useful for this course, for my part of the course. These are the two main textbooks I use. Gary Nichols' 2009 edition, Sedimentology and Stratigraphy, is a good textbook. It covers all the concepts of sediments and stratigraphy. Also Boggs, 2006. But basically any first year introductory textbook on Earth surface processes and sediments and sedimentary rocks is good enough. Alright, because this is an introductory course. Okay, so I'll start with this photo here. Photo of a tidal flat along the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia. This is near to this is actually Bagan Lalang, right? So you have the resort on this side here, towards the north. Okay, and if you look at the tidal flat here, there's also a beach at the back, a very narrow beach, right? And you notice this light colored material and these darker colored materials, right? So these are your sediments, okay? And you've seen sediment before, you've touched sediment before, things like sand and mud, right? So these are sediments, okay? And you also notice that they have been distributed and shaped into these nice geometries, right? Okay. So what is shaping these sediments? Well, the sediments are interacting with physical processes like wind and water, right? A physical process like the waves and also the tides, right? And the tides and the waves are actually transporting all this material, and because of that movement, they form these really nice, beautiful geometries you see on the Bagan Lalang tidal flat and also beach. Okay. All right. So again, I repeat myself. The main topic of this course is sediments and sedimentary rocks. So first, let's look at the definition of what sediments are, right? So everybody knows what sediments are, right? You've seen it before. Examples here: mud is a sediment, sand, and also gravel. All these are sediments, right? A sediment is primarily formed by the accumulation of grains. Okay, so grains are just smaller particles, right? And if I zoom in into a sand, this is what you see. Lots of small particles here, made up of minerals and also fragments of older rocks. Okay, so those are grains. Okay, so you have accumulation of grains. And how do you get grains? From the breakdown of pre-existing minerals and rocks at the surface. Okay, and this breaking down of older minerals and rocks, we call it weathering. Okay, and then all this material which is weathered needs to be transported somewhere else and then redeposited, okay, by an agent of transport. It is usually a fluid. The most common agent of transport, the most important agent of transport on our planet is water, but it can also be because of wind and also because of ice. Okay, but we'll talk more about agents of transport later. Okay, so so sand, mud, gravel, all these are sediments, right? But in geology, it's, when we say sand, there's a specific definition for it, right? So we define it by the size of the grains. Okay, so when I say sand or grain of sand, right, I mean that the grain is between 0.0625 to 2 millimeters in size. Okay, so very specific when you talk to a geologist. Okay, and anything below 0.0625 millimeter, we call it a mud. Okay, okay. You can even subdivide muds into two types. You have silt, which is the coarser grain fraction, and so clay, which is the finer grain fraction. All right, and then you have really coarse grains above 2 millimeters. We call it gravels. Okay, so photos here: mud, sand, and gravel. Right. So these are very coarse grains. So you can subdivide into smaller subdivisions. You have granules, pebbles, cobbles, and boulders as you move into coarser and coarser grain fractions, right? So things you can have boulders which are the sizes of houses, let's say. So that's a boulder, right? But it's made up of the same thing. It's made up of minerals which have been broken down, or rock fragments which have been broken down. Okay. All right, so let's have a look at how sediments are formed. Okay, so that if you remember the definition, it has to be weathered, it has to be transported, has to be deposited somewhere else. Okay, so I draw here a simple cartoon of a continent. Okay? So this is my continental basement. It's made up of older rock. In this case, let's say it is an igneous rock. It's granite, let's say, right? Okay, so you have a mountain here which is exposed to the element. Because it's exposed to element, it can be broken down by the process of weathering. So you start to get smaller grains forming, right? It's breaking down to smaller grains. Now, the grains will be interacting with rivers flowing down the mountain. And the rivers also will be flowing along the continental shelf here, right? So they will be transporting all this material. Lots of grains with different sizes to them: sand, mud, gravel, and so on, right? But eventually it will reach the deep marine area, the sea, right? And the sea floor is deep, so it's a depression, right? We call it a basin, right? Or a sink sometimes, right? So it is a depression, and wherever you have a depression, you can have sediment accumulating inside that depression. Okay, so weathered material transported by the rivers, it reaches the sea. Then once it reaches the sea, it loses energy, it becomes deposited. So this is your sediment. Okay? Okay, that's how sediments are formed. So I usually show these photos at the top here. These three photos. These are from Langkawi, right, along the northern coast. Maybe you know Telaga Judio, right? The Seven Wells, very popular tourist spot with waterfalls, right? So this is one of the waterfalls. And this is on the mountain. It's made up of the rock granite, which is an igneous rock. Okay, so water is coursing through the granite here. So what happens? It carves through the rock. Okay, now further downstream, you notice along the bed of the stream here, you get broken up fragments of the igneous rock here. So the rocks have been broken down to smaller pieces. You're starting to get grains, right? But here the grains are quite coarse. They are gravel size. Okay. Now further downstream, as you go further downstream, your water, your river, your streams eventually reach the coast. on the beach, right? And when you go to the beach, this is Pantai Pasir Hitam, right? The black sand beach, right? Along the northern coast. And here, you also get sediments, but they are not in the form of smaller particles, finer grain sand in this case, sand, right? And notice the color here. Some of the sands are lighter colored, some of the sands are black in color. So why the different colors? Well, because of the different mineral composition. Okay, so the lighter colored material here is sand grains made up of the mineral quartz, SiO2, silicon dioxide. Alright, the darker colored minerals here are made up of other kinds of minerals. It's mostly tourmaline and also ilmenite. Okay, and all these materials, all these broken up particles here, originated from the mountains here, from Telagi Tujuh. Alright, so they have been weathered, they have been transported and then deposited on the beach at Pantai Pasir Hitam. Okay. Okay. So yeah, that's how you get sediments. Now the sediment source can be any kind of rock. It doesn't have to be igneous rock, just like I showed you here. Older metamorphic rock can also be a source. Even older sedimentary rock can also be a source. Further towards that side, towards the west here, you see some of these cliffs here. These are made up of sandstones, and they are also being eroded, right? And they are going to form younger sediment, right? Okay, so those are what sediments are and how they were formed. Okay, so the study of sediments is called sedimentology. Okay, it's not just sediments, also the rock that is formed from sediments, which are called sedimentary rocks. Okay, so the sedimentologist studies everything about sediments and sedimentary rocks. This includes the type of sediments, the structures that are formed by sediments and sedimentary rocks, how they originated, in what environments do they develop in, and how does sediment transform into sedimentary rock. So these are some of the major topics in sedimentology. So I'm a sedimentologist. So my work is mainly on sandstones and mudstones, right? But other sedimentologists may be working on things like limestone or chert, ancient rocks or modern day environments and so on. Okay. All right. So you have geologists which are studying sediments and sedimentary rocks, and you start to ask why. What is the importance of studying sediments? The benefits are numerous. One, it has economic importance. For example, oil and gas, right, used for energy, is usually contained in a reservoir made up of sedimentary rock, things like sandstone and limestone. Okay, for example, this is the Grand Old Lady, the first oil well in Miri town in Sarawak, right? In the past century, it produced oil, right, from wells here, right? And the oil is actually coming out from sandstone. Sandstone is containing the oil. Okay, so you can get you can get earth resources from sedimentary rocks. Other kinds of sedimentary rocks contain, for example, banded iron formations. So you can get iron ore associated with these kinds of sedimentary rocks, and also other kinds of sediment-hosted ores. Okay, so it's a good idea to know the characteristics of sedimentary rocks that can contain these kinds of earth resources, so you can better manage them, so you can come up with better strategies to explore for these kinds of resources. All right. Well, yeah, one more example here. This is the Merit Pila coal mine in Sarawak. So coal is also a form of sedimentary rock. Okay. Additionally, humans also grow food on a substrate, which is usually a sediment, right? For example, paddy fields, right? At the bottom you have a clay layer, let's say, right? And clay is a sediment. Or you can even build structures on sedimentary rock and sediments, right? For example, the Petronas Twin Towers excuse me, is underlain by sedimentary rocks. The Kuala Lumpur limestone. Below it is the limestone. Right. So you really need. So the geologists should really know the properties of the rocks which are underlying these structures that we are building, because people are living inside these things, are working inside these things. They have to be safe, right? So we need to know the properties, right? And of course, like I mentioned before, we're taking resources from our sedimentary rocks and sediments, oil, gas. We're also putting things into our sedimentary rocks. Right now, people are talking about carbon dioxide sequestration, right? We're trying to trap carbon dioxide into the subsurface underground, and the container is usually a sedimentary rock. It's limestone or sandstone and so on. Okay. We also hide our garbage and other waste material in it. Okay. So when we put it in landfills, all this rubbish here, so some of the toxic chemicals can leach into the substrate below, and the substrate can be a sediment or a sedimentary rock. So again, it is important to understand the various properties of the sedimentary cover and have systematic methods for describing these properties, right? Okay, so now let's go to the lecture proper. Right, so we've looked at the definition of sediments. Let's look at the different types of sediments. How do you classify sediments? Well, you can classify them first on the basis of the way in which they were formed, okay, and also on the basis of the composition or the size of the particles. Okay, so sediments basically can be divided into two types. We have clastic sediments and also chemical sediments. Okay, so two types of sediments. So let's have a look at this one by one. I go to classic sediments first. Right. So what are classic sediments? Sand, mud, gravel. These are classic sediments. So they are composed of broken up pieces of older rocks and minerals, your grains, right? Okay. And the individual fragments, these individual grains, are either individual mineral grains or bits of rock. Okay, so that is a classic sediment. For example, here I have a sand, and if I put it under a microscope, this is what I see. The grains of sand, and they are made up of minerals. Right? So in this case, it's mainly the mineral quartz, okay, SiO2. Okay, so this is a sedimentary rock. So you need to differentiate between sediment and sedimentary rock, right? They're two different things. And this is a clastic sedimentary rock. This is a conglomerate. The origin was a gravel. We'll talk about that later. So you have classic sediments, and then you also have chemical sediments. What are chemical sediments? These are sediments which are precipitated from a solution. Okay. Classic sediments, they are made, geology say. So you need to break apart older rock, maybe hammer it or something, right, and you get smaller grains, right, and this can be transported. So that is classic. But in other cases, it appears like for chemical sediments, it appears like the sediment is born. They come out of nothing, basically. But it's not really coming out of nothing, right? They're coming out from a solution. Okay? For example, you have a shallow body of water in the tropics, in the Bahamas, let's say here, right? It's very shallow water, and then the climate is very dry and very hot, right? So what happens is that the water becomes evaporated, right? It's drying up. So any ions you have in the water becomes concentrated, and the water becomes saturated with certain ions like calcium, like carbonate, and so on, right? Okay, so as it becomes super saturated, crystals start to grow out. You start to get minerals forming. They precipitate out. Okay, so in this case, in the case of the Bahamas, you get the mineral calcite being deposited here. Sorry, I can't remember whether it's calcite or aragonite, but it is calcium carbonate, CaCO3, being precipitated out to form grains of sediment. They're calling them ooids here, but that is for another topic, right? So you have grains of sediment here. So this is a chemical sediment, a sediment which has been precipitated from a solution. There's a third subcategory that you need to know. These are biogenic sediments. This is where you have the sediment forming with the help of a living organism. animal or plant or microorganism and so on, right? They do not really constitute a distinct class of sediments. You can have clastic biogenic sediments and also chemical biogenic sediments. Okay, so let's look at some examples of these. Okay, let's have a chemical biogenic sediments. Right? So in the case of chemical biogenic sediments, a particular mineral is precipitated by an organism living in the water to build its shell or its exoskeleton, right? But then the animal dies or the organism dies, the soft tissue decays, you're just left with the mineral matter, right? So for example, corals are animals, they are multicellular organisms they are colonial animals, and they have a skeleton, and the skeleton is made up of the mineral calcium carbonate. It's made of mineral calcite, the same material that is forming limestone, like the Kuala Lumpur limestone, right? In fact, if you go to some of the limestones throughout the whole world, including Malaysia, let's say you go to Perlis and you go to some of the limestones there, which are very ancient, something like 300 million years old, you can even see fossil corals inside the limestone, because that was its origin. It was biogenic in nature. The corals formed the rock. Okay, so modern day coral reefs look like this. This can be buried. It changes into the rock called limestone. Okay, but it doesn't have to be large organisms. It can also be microorganisms. Microorganisms can also form sediments and sedimentary rock. For example, this is a microorganism that we call radiolaria. They are unicellular. They have one cell only, like amoeba, but they have a skeleton, and the skeleton is made up of SiO2, silica. It's the same composition as the mineral quartz, right? Okay, so you can imagine all these are plankton living in the water column. The organism dies, you're left with its skeleton. All these skeletons falling down, they accumulate to form a layer, right? And the layer can be buried. It changes into rock, and the rock is called a chert. All right, so you can have that also being. You can have those kinds of biogenic sediments forming also. Other fossils, other kinds of microorganisms can also form sediments. For example, foraminifera, right, and diatoms, right? Okay, so that is chemical biogenic sediments. But you also have clastic biogenic sediments. How do you get clastic biogenic sediments? Well, imagine in a shallow sea, you have lots of these shells, right? Maybe cockle shells and so on, right? And they are biogenic in origin. But then you have a storm, and this storm has large waves, and these waves move all these shells onto the beach here. And a lot of them are broken apart, right? Now, they have been transported, right, and accumulated by wave or current action. And this debris is a clastic biogenic sediment, right, because it has been broken apart and transported. Okay, so you can have clastic biogenic sediments, you can have chemical biogenic sediments. Okay, and then your sediments with time can turn into a rock. Go from sediment to a sedimentary rock. Okay, so I don't want to go too much into this part here. You know what a rock is, right? A solid cohesive aggregate of one or more minerals, right? It's made up of lots of smaller particles inside it. Except for a sandstone, which is lithified sand, it's made up of lots and lots of grains of the mineral quartz in this case. Okay, or an igneous rock, there are lots of different kinds of minerals forming the crystals inside your igneous rock here. I believe everybody knows the three types of rocks, right? You have igneous rocks, you have sedimentary rocks, you have metamorphic rocks. I'm just going to focus on the sedimentary rocks. Igneous rock is where you have molten rock, molten magma, let's say, right, from in underground, right, and then as it goes into shallower depths, it cools down, so the material forms crystals, right? It grows like that, it forms crystals, and the crystals interlock, and you form a new rock, which is called igneous rock. Okay, so a simple example: you have volcanoes, you have lava coming out, right? And the lava cools down, it forms a kind of igneous rock. Okay, so we have volcanic rock. Okay, and they are crystalline in nature. They don't form individual broken up pieces. They are form interlocking crystals. But then you have sedimentary rocks. You have sediment, But then sediments undergo the process of lithification and diagenesis. We'll talk about that later, how they form rock, right? But this has to be at very low temperatures and also near to the Earth's surface, right? Yeah, we need to have low temperatures because if high temperatures, it's going to get molten, right? Okay. So this is an example of a sedimentary rock. This is the rock conglomerate. Right? Originally, it was a sediment called gravel. Now it has been lithified through the process of diagenesis. Then you have metamorphic rocks. This is when you have igneous rocks or sedimentary rocks, and when you apply pressure on it and also temperature, right? But not enough to melt it, but enough to change the fabric of the rock and also some of the minerals inside the rock. So this is a metamorphic rock. Okay. So you have things like, for example, maybe you start with a igneous rock like granite, but then because of pressure and temperature, it changes to the metamorphic rock called a gneiss, Gneiss. Okay. So you have the three types of rocks, but remember they're also all made up of the same material up from the earth. It's coming from the earth. It's the same material, and you just get different kinds of minerals, right? So why do you get the different kinds of rock? It's just mainly recycling of the same material, right? And you get the recycling of the same material because the earth is not static, it is moving around. Okay, you have these large plates. These are crustal plates. They are solid, they are moving around. Sometimes they collide with each other, sometimes they slide along each other, sometimes they are separating from each other, right? They're moving around. Okay, so you have these continental plates here, right? Why are they moving around? Because in the earth there is an engine. You have radioactive decay, lots and lots of it. You get a lot of heat, right? And that heat is actually fueling, it's triggering the movement of all the material in the earth here, the interior of the earth. So that's where you get all these plates moving here. Okay, and because of all these plates moving around, in some places you get cracks because plates are separating. You get magma coming out. You get igneous rock forming. Right. In other places where you get collision, you also get igneous rock forming mountain ranges and so on. But then when you have mountain ranges, all these older igneous rocks are eroded and weathered, right? And they're deposited somewhere else, they form sediments, and they can be lithified to sedimentary rock. Right. But in other places, because of the collision, high pressure and temperature results in all these other kinds of rocks changing into a metamorphic rock. And the cycle continues. All this material becoming recycling on and on, retransforming, right? Right? So the rocks are constantly recycled, buried, deformed, heated underground, then uplifted, exposed, eroded on surface. And cyclical, so your sedimentary rock can change into metamorphic rock, into igneous, and so on, lots of different kinds of cycles here. And this cycle is called the rock cycle. Okay? But let's go back to the topic of this course. I just want to talk about sedimentary rocks. Only one type of sedimentary rock. Okay, rock formed from sediments. So sedimentary rocks, they form at very low temperatures. They form at and near the Earth's surface. And they form by the process of lithification or consolidation through diagenesis. Don't worry about these terms here. We'll have another separate lecture for the process of lithification through diagenesis. Okay. So, usually we name a sedimentary rock based on the original sediment. For example, this is a sandstone because it originated from a sand which has been lithified. This is a mudstone from mud, of course, right? But sometimes we use the term things like clay stone if we really know that the grain size was clay size, or a siltstone and so on, right? So rocks made up of calcium carbonate like this, you can even have a fossil shell inside it. This is a limestone. Lime is calcium carbonate. Okay, so this is a chemical sedimentary rock. But there are also other sedimentary rock names we need to know. Yeah, but geologists should be familiar with these terms. This is a conglomerate. The original rock was a gravel, right? A chert is formed by siliceous ooze, by all this plankton, right? With the skeleton made out of silica. And this is a chemical sedimentary rock we call chert, forms these nice ribbon-like layers. A shale is a special kind of mudstone, right? It's a form of mudstone where you have facility. I mean, it can break apart into bedding planes in flakes or sheets like that. That's a shale, right? And it is usually dominated by clay-sized particles. So it has higher clay content, right? So these are clastic sedimentary rocks. Okay, so sedimentary rocks, okay, interesting. Okay, so you have sediments and sedimentary rocks, and there's certain names to them that we've looked at how they are formed and so on, right? Okay. So let's have a look at the distribution of sedimentary rocks on the Earth. Let's have a look at the crust, let's say, right? So the crust is just the 5 to 40 kilometer outermost layer of the Earth, and it's solid, okay? What is it made up of in terms of lithology, right? Rock type. It's mainly made up of igneous rock, okay? And sedimentary rocks only make up 5% of it. And when you start to go back to the topic about the importance of sedimentary rocks, say, so what's the big deal, right? Sedimentary rocks is just 5%. Not really that important, right? But remember, we are humans. We don't live 5, 10, 30 kilometers below the surface. We live on the surface itself, right? And if you just focus on the surface is mainly 75% of the Earth's surface is mainly made up of sedimentary rock, and igneous rock only forms a smaller percentage, just a quarter of the whole total, right? So 25%. Okay. So we live there, so it's going to be very important, right? So yeah, just a percentage of relative extent of rock types exposed at the Earth's surface, right? A lot of it is shale, and then you have sandstones, limestones, and then you have granite and basalt and others, right? Okay. So almost near to the end, I go back to Bagan Lalang. Now I'm facing towards the north. That's the resort there, and this is my tidal flat, right? And now I can talk about sediments here, right? So I have sand with grains, right? The darker particles here are mud. So these are sediments, and they have a certain shape and geometry to them and distribution to them because they have been transported by the agent of transport called water, right? And the environment here is a tidal flat. So this, given enough time, can be transformed into a sedimentary rock through the process of lithification. These are sedimentary rocks. The lighter colored material is sandstone. The grey color here is mudstone. Okay, the sedimentary rocks here are 20 million years old. Okay, it is in Sarawak, human for scale on that side here, right? Right, and these were deposited on a beach and a tidal flat 20 million years ago, right? And because of burial, has been turned into rock, sedimentary rock here. Okay, so that's how you I'll stop there. I think that's a last slide. In next lectures we go through delve deeper into how the different characteristics of sedimentary rock. Okay, thanks. That's it for today.